I don't remember who said it. I think it was Anand or it was Subrat. I don't know. That they said that, what if this happens, what if that happens, and then he sent and told me, why are you not doing it this way? And I told him, no, because other companies have tried to do it this way, it hasn't worked. Uh, and he said, no, you need to do it and even if it's wrong, you make your own mistake. If you think it's going to work, you make it once you're on. Because I think one of the key problems that I always face as an entrepreneur is that when I've relied on other people's learnings, right? So when you read a book or you read some other people's learnings, and it's a great learning tool, but if you still in your guts think that something needs to be done, which is anti what everyone is telling you, I always believe you should try and pilot it out. It's very difficult as an entrepreneur to go back and feel that you relied on someone else's learnings and that shaped where your business is today. I've been a firm believer that you need to make your own mistakes. It helps you learn, first of all, and it helps you live with that mistake.
Hey Souvik, thanks a lot for agreeing to do this. Really looking forward to the conversation. You've built a unique company and very keen to learn about your story.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Cool. Souvik, so, would love to start with a background and your journey till date. If you could talk about growing up, your early days, college, first few jobs, and any, potential seeds for the idea that you made infra market, and potentially any inspirations for starting a company. If you could talk about those, that would be very, very helpful.
Yeah. So for me, my initial years were in Calcutta. So I grew up there, and my schooling happened there. Although my dad did keep shifting his jobs around, so I spent some time in Africa, sometimes in Gujarat, but majority of my relevant schooling happened out of Calcutta. I like it was a I think as a kid, wasn't really from a business family, or wasn't really from a background where where you would have a lot of entrepreneurship. Obviously, at that time, the entire culture of startups or entire ecosystem of startups, even when we were in sort of later part of my education, wasn't really sort of prevalent as it is today. So I think that is sort of one of the key things that it surprised me that when I was sort of but today when I move out, that it was so alien to us at that time. Alien, I think entrepreneurship at that time, my understanding as a kid was always it was sort of a family thing, right? When you looked at entrepreneurs, you looked at family businesses, you looked at people, and India's biggest entrepreneurs were all second generation or third generation. You didn't have rarely you heard of a first generation entrepreneur coming out of India. And as a kid, I think entrepreneurship never entered my mind. I then shifted to Bombay in around, and I think Calcutta as a community also, it's not entrepreneurship is not very prevalent. It's not in your face. So I think that's how I'll put it. So I think when I shifted to Bombay around 2001 when I sort of wanted to after schooling, and that's when I sort of understood that there are opportunities obviously beyond the regular 9 to sort of jobs, or there are career opportunities in entrepreneurship. If and at that time while startups had not really taken off then, but you did have the Info Edges of the world where you had some first generation entrepreneurs making it large. You had some news about Info Edge coming out. You had a couple of other sort of, what I would say, it's sort of the generation before the Flipkarts of the world. You had those guys sort of making it big. Post that, I think I went into a job. So I did my CA. I passed out my CA in 2009. I sort of went for a job, and I think 2009 to 2014 I worked for infrastructure companies. I worked for construction infrastructure companies in this sector. 2014 I quit my job. I sort of wanted to at that time wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I realized that just doing commercial and financial functions for construction companies at that time wasn't exciting me a lot. I went to pursue a management education. I passed out, and at that time there were a lot of startups. By then obviously the entire boom had happened. Right? So You had the Flipkarts of the world and Snapdeals and all the Paytms, all the large players, were making a lot of noise. Obviously, B2B was still sort of unheard of, right? So you didn't have anything in B2B. There were a couple of players, like IndiaMart would be an example, but that's not pure commerce B2B. It's more like a sort of, they have a different take on the business, right? So, and at that time, there were a couple of companies in the construction ecosystem, startups that started out. One was M Supply. They were sort of, just picking up. They were just sort of starting out at that time. This is 2016. And that's when I just thought that M Supply was more a matchmaking platform. Oh, and there were a couple of other players. There was this company by Dalmia. I think it was Bilzar or something. Dalmia Group, Puri Dalmia has started this. And there were a couple of other players who had started something. And at that time, I just thought, why not try to do something? And our take on this was a little different. We want to do a fulfillment platform. We didn't want to be a marketplace. We wanted to be end-to-end fulfillment. And we started this in 2016. So while I knew about startups, I never sort of, I could today consider that a good thing, but I never sort of was too aware about the ecosystem. I wasn't too aware of, and I think that also partly because I stayed in Mumbai a lot and was never part of the Bangalore sort of a startup culture. And I never realized that external fundraising was something we were not looking at that time. So I was sort of, so we ran this company for like 3 years. So like and then the entire cycle started, and we'll come to that when the fundraising sort of, craziness started in 2019 in B2B. And that's when we sort of came into attention. But before that, 2016 to 2019, we ran this bootstrap. And we ran this bootstrap and grew this, like we put, like, I think it feels crazy now, but we put everything on the stake. I think I mortgaged my whatever assets I had, my parents. I know my co-founder did his parents, his in-laws. So we put everything. We put everything on sort of on the line there to build this out. And till around 2019, when we suddenly got a lot of interest from VCs at that time. That okay, you know what, B2B is something we are looking at, and then sort of things just skyrocketed. So that's and we are here now.
That's fascinating. I'd love to talk about the early days a bit, and before we deep dive into the topic, what were the early days like? You started at around a time when the startup ecosystem was just going through its first collapse in some way. 2016 hyperlocal really picked up, and then suddenly there were companies dying left, right, and center. Nobody was able to raise capital. Did that influence your decision making, or like you said that you were insulated from the Bangalore ecosystem, so it never really came in?
Yeah, sort of. I would say we were ignorant. We were ignorant of the startup ecosystem. So it didn't matter to us whether it was 2014 or 16 or it didn't matter at that time because we were so insulated and so ignorant about the system that the system was going through a crisis was never that money was going out of the system. So it was just for us. It was just so we were the way we were looking at it is 2009 construction had a boom till 2009 to 2010 11. Construction had a sort of a slump then, maybe 11 to 16, 11 to 14 odd, and construction was up, picking it back up. There were a lot of companies a lot of the smaller companies which had boomed in that phase had moved out, had sort of passed, but overall companies were doing better. And at that time for us, that was what we were tracking. We were tracking whether, and we were tracking that, look, for me, my idea was to digitize construction manufacturing companies. And the idea was, can construction material companies get digitized? Can we create an asset-light platform where construction materials get sold? And the entire context behind that was that construction had faced a depressing time from 2010 to 2014, where suddenly material manufacturers had realized that they were sitting on huge amount of capacity. They had built up capacity, thinking of a boom of sort of a growth scenario, and they needed to sort of use that capacity out. They needed people to come and use it. And also what we realized is some of the best companies in India, some of the most valued companies have got built out in this sector. You look at the brands today, Ultratech, Asian Paints, Pidilite, some of the largest brands, right? Have got built out from here. And that's when we thought, can we do this asset light? Can we take those brands and can we build out something large, in a horizontal play, multiple products? but do it asset light way. So we were too insulated. We were too insulated from the ecosystem to understand that look, the money was not in this, the money was moving out rather than moving in. And luckily, because then I think what helped was that then you sort of built it out, and then when the money was coming in, you were at the right place at the right time. So if I wasn't building something out in 2016, I wouldn't be able to take the money in 2019. So
right, understood. And
yeah.
why did you pick this problem specifically?
I think I was part of this industry for 4-5 years. So for me, what we had sort of realized that, so there are 4 theses sort of we worked on. So at that time, thesis were that one of the major theses, if you look at construction material sector, you look at tiles, okay, as an example, or any other product, you will notice that the large brands own around 30-40% market share. Okay, no matter which product line. So you can pick up tiles. You have Kajaria, Cera, Johnson, all the largest brands pick up 40%. Anybody who's in the industry will know majority of manufacturing of tiles happens by local manufacturers sitting out of Morbi, sitting out of Gujarat. They are manufacturing these products. The idea for us at that time was, one, that a lot of local brands exist. 2, the way traditionally the industry has tackled the problem of construction is that they have set up mega factories. So they'll set up a mega factory somewhere and they'll transport everywhere in India. And they will have multiple distribution channels. They'll have D1, D2, D3, D4. And there'll be a lot of intermediaries and a lot of margins going in between. We wanted to tackle this problem saying, can we instead buy small capacity from each factory instead of setting up one mega facility and build? And what we will lose is economies of scale. We'll lose that efficiency. But what we'll gain is logistic cost, because we are going to build factories very near to where the consumer wants it. We'll buy 10% capacity from each small manufacturer. And we will build a layer of service, build a layer of quality on top of this. And we create a brand. So why we started this was because there's obviously a huge opportunity. Nobody wants to work in this sector. No startup in the right mind wants to come into infra. It's not like you want to grow, you read a lot and decide infra is the play. So yeah, so there was lack of competition, and first of all, there was no one doing it. Second, it was getting done. So there were companies individually trying to do this. So I'll tell you an example. Cera is a sanitary ware company. When it went into tiles, it went without manufacturing. It went the model we were doing, and they were starting this around 2016-17. They said we'll contract manufacture and sell, only stamp the brand. Okay. Kajaria is a tiles company. They started plywood. They have zero manufacturing in plywood. So there were individual companies who had built a thesis around contract manufacturing and asset light brand. And for us, we were sort of taking this to the next level where they were doing it at the same time. So they were doing this thesis at the same time that we were doing it. But at that time, it was apparent to many people. It wasn't just us that can a thing what has been done in FMCG for years, get someone else to manufacture and you brand it yourself. Why can't it get done in products like this? What stops? Especially with products with such a large logistic cost, where you want a distributed manufacturing. And I think it just sort of globally it's done by some people, and we just sort of took it upon ourselves to sort of implement something like this in India, and it just worked for us. That's about it.
It's a great segue for our topic for this week, which is disrupting an unsexy industry. So I want to start off with getting your first customers. Even though you were from the industry, it's still hard, right? Developing close-knit groups, and they have a lot of, they're well known, they have a lot of influence in this local area. So how did you go about breaking in, getting your first few customers?
I think the idea was to first get that first supplier. Right? So how do you tie up on supply? And that sort of went ahead. We got our first supplier tie-ups happening by promising a lot of things, which we were not sure we could provide. So we promised a substantial improvement in their capacity. We said, okay, you're selling 20 tons of material where your capacity is 100 tons a day. We can take that 20 tons up to 40, 50 tons. And that was that first sort of, first supplier of the commitment. We also went ahead and did a lot of refurbishment to their plants, which we did at our cost. So the idea was, the first difficult point was not even the customer, it was the supplier. So suppose I get a customer, where do I supply him from? So that first thing was, how do I get a supplier on board? And getting a supplier on board was that first sort of, it took us a couple of months to sort that out. And then we sort of get into a customer route where we would have to go ahead and so we have also hired a lot of people from the industry. So we also hire a lot of people from the industry who've built out large brands. For example, our person who builds out chemical that we hired early on in this was someone from Asian Paint, someone from BSF. So someone who had a lot of experience. The person who hired from Steel was the ex-CEO of Vedanta Group. So we sort of went out and we realized that while first principle thinking was critical, to bridge that gap, that initial sort of onboarding problem where we had to get the initial customer, we also needed some very heavy hitters on the sales front, on the customer front, to build those things out for us. And one of the ways I was going to get built out was getting people who had spent years doing this in the industry and getting them to do it in a new way. And we were successful in hiring a couple of people. For example, in concrete, we hired someone who was Asia Pacific head of Lafarge. So we sort of went out and hired a lot of people who could sort of build out a different version of what they were doing earlier. And that also sort of helped us get that first customer because they brought a lot of credibility with them. Me and my co-founder walking into a large construction company, trying to get an order would be impossible for us, right? It would be almost me. So we had to go initially, at least, with a lot of heavy hitters who had done this day in, day out in the industry. And that sort of eventually, today, the structure of the company may be different. We may have a lot of first principle thinking in the company today, but initially to get sales, because see, as a company, we had to meet because we were not funded for like, and we've never, and that was not an option also at that time. So for us, the idea was that revenue has to get generated from day one, and we have to generate revenue, we have to pay salaries, we have to pay costs. And the easiest way we thought that was going to get done was to sort of go out and hire people who had done this day in, day out in the industry and sort of build it out, and sort of leverage on their experience, leverage on their sales channels. And that was our first step for us.
Which sounds simple, but you had to convince these people to kind of get on board.
So yeah, that was So it's. I think that was the first one took a lot of time to convince. So once one of the guys joined, so that's why I always tell startups when they sort of get me, that we want to get XYZ CEO of the XYZ company to join us. I always tell them that, in the initial years, you will never get the best guy to join you. So the guy whom we got maybe on that first to get that to write that first sort of customer for us, to get the first customer, is no longer part of the company, perhaps.
Right.
Because what happens is that when you go in, you cannot go and get a national head initially. So what will you do when you go into a company and you want to hire from Asian Paints, or you want to hire from a Lafarge, or you want to hire from one of these branded players, and you want to hire a really nice guy who has sort of done it? You will not get him on the day zero. So you have to hire a person who is at least 3 to 4 ranks below him, right? And you have to elevate them to a position they would not get in a traditional company.
Right.
So you take someone who's a city head and make him a national head or a state head, and you give him responsibility, give him a sort of a position which they would never have got in 6 months in a traditional company. And you have to lure them in because, on day zero to go and get the perfect candidate is not going to happen.
Of course, yeah.
And a lot of the people we got then either have been with us and have sort of understood that position, and there have been other people who have come in senior to them, or if they have not, then they have obviously moved on. And that's a sad part of as a startup, because sometimes it's impossible to get that right talent at the right. But that initial guy, even if he was a state level, city level guy, getting him on board initially by offering him a much senior position initially helped us get a lot of customers on board. And once we had customers on board, to then go and hire good talent made sense, and it was easier. So there are a lot of things that you have to work out, that maybe you offer someone an opportunity he'll not get externally. And look, some of these people have lived up. Some of the people we hired as who were city heads of a company, and we made them national heads, they've actually lived up to that, and they've actually grown into it, and they continue. And obviously there's going to be a situation where some of them will not grow into the role, and you have to live with that situation. But yeah, the initial idea was to give them a growth opportunity more than they would get anywhere in the industry.
Just amazing. The other part that I wanted to ask about was, it's a heavily regulated industry. You probably have to deal with governments and cartels. And I'm sure that the people that you hired played a huge role in that as well. Was that
Yeah, so people we hired played a huge role in the entire management sort of thing of this situation. I think we are a very operational intensive company. We do a lot of fulfillment. We're not a pure marketplace, so it comes as part and parcel of what we do day in day out, meeting cartels, meeting local issues, and I think that it also varies city to city. Today we are setting up in Calcutta, so West Bengal will have its own issues with related to these things which Maharashtra won't have. So I think it's a very local sort of things that we have to manage. Initially, obviously, we did it. We would get our hands dirty, go out there and solve these issues. But today, obviously, there are people in the team who do it. But for the first couple of years, it was us. It was us. In fact, so I think for the first couple of years, me and Aditya spent a lot of time maybe staying out or working out of factories because it made no sense to work in an office because you were essentially trying to change the way the factories manufacture. And so we spend a lot of time there. So we've loaded vehicles, we've sort of been there, done that on the process level because at that time you have everything on the line, so you can't choose to not be part of it. Like even if you get an employee and suppose they have to manage the supply chain and they are not able to, end of the day it's you paying that check for the salary, you paying that check for day-to-day expenses, so you have to go out there and do it. It's as simple as that. You have to be able to get your hands dirty to it. I am a firm believer that no business is above the human capacity to learn that business. So I mean, no matter what technology you're learning, no matter what problems you're solving, no business is so complex that you as a person cannot learn and grow into it. Obviously there could be some weird examples which are true, that yes, you cannot learn something on the job, but my understanding is that as a business person, as an entrepreneur, you have to be ready to learn it, and you have to believe that no task in your entire business is something that you cannot learn and do, and that's what we believed at that time, at least.
I want to talk a bit more about cartels. I think it's something that's unique. Very few tech startups in India have to deal with that. So can you maybe give our listeners an understanding of, how
it's something you deal with every day? Like, even today, for example, when we go into a new product line, it's very much possible we'll face a cartel situation. And so there are multiple levels of cartels, right? So first cartel is where the large manufacturers sort of don't want you to open a new brand.
Mhm.
So your supplier could get a call. See, because these are small suppliers, so your supplier could get a call tomorrow that, look, don't supply to these players. They'll build a brand around you, and then you will no longer be relevant. So that is one sort of insight, and then that becomes sort of a complex issue. Second is when you are transporting material, you have to use local suppliers. There's so many issues. Like if you're working out of Navi Mumbai, or you're working out of any, except I would say Mumbai, most places I have worked in have an issue with transportation. You have to work with local people, otherwise it becomes a complex issue trying to manage such those things. Another thing that we've realized is that there are obviously cartels in and around where you're selling. You have local, and this is not only prevalent to us, it's prevalent to every infra company. So if as an infra company, you're going and setting up something in a new location, there are a lot of local issues. You have to give employment to the local players, and these are things that we deal with every day. So there are multiple facets of this management of this cartel situation, or I would say sort of arm twisting situation. But it's less prevalent in metros, is how I would put it. It's more and more prevalent as you step out. And I think one of the things that most startups in India don't do, that we have to do, is actually work out of cities which are tier 2, tier 3 cities, and you have to work with the underbelly of the Indian economy. You're working with people who are not connected to what is happening in Mumbai and Bangalore. So if you're working in, if you're working in some, some sort of, so if you're doing a project in Kolhapur or Sangli, you have to manage local sensibilities there. And most, whether it's B2C startups, B2B startups, don't have to deal with that complexity of the business. The good thing about that is, when you are starting to deal with those complexities of business, you suddenly realize that itself is a moat. I think a lot of VCs in India don't realize that. And I think not only VCs, a lot of entrepreneurs in India don't realize that operational efficiency also is a moat, eventually in any business.
Right.
Yeah. So if you are operationally very efficient and are able to run business anywhere in India, that itself is a moat for next level of competitors trying to come in. So if you're a B2B startup in India and you're working in metro cities and you've never worked there, When you work there, that's a new challenge that you'll come up with. And if there is someone else who's your competitor who's had experience working there or has been successfully working in tier 3 cities, that complex, that'll be they'll throw a very good challenge to you. They'll be a very good challenger if they're trying to sort of, and I think that is also operationally a very good mode to build, that you are operationally very efficient and you can deal with these issues, because these issues will come up. If you're a B2B company doing transport, doing fulfillment, doing logistics, I'm sure every logistics company in India has faced these issues. Because I think that is the area where it's most sort of prevalent, right? When you're doing full truckloads or part truckload logistics, transporters, talking to drivers, helpers, operators, that's where these cartels are most active. I think that is where sort of it gets very, very complex, where you have to deal with these issues. But that lets you build its own sort of moat around your business, because not many new age startups want to go that route, to be honest.
Would love to understand a bit more about how you did that. I mean, it was such an operationally intensive business and you guys bootstrapped in the beginning. You didn't even have any outside funding. How did you ensure a high level of quality? I mean, that was essentially a USP, right?
So quality for us was, so we had to initially spend 2 to 3 months at manufacturers' locations. So we had to put in, so we first started by giving manufacturers software to run their business. We started automating their plants. And we started by putting in load cells in the manufacturing plant. So we initially, when we started, we first gave a data entry sort of system to the manufacturer. Look, whenever you're producing something, mention that how much raw materials you're using and everything, so we can monitor quality. Then we realized that none of them are going to put in data. So because you're not dealing with a very clean or sort of very well structured manufacturing concern. You're dealing with a very sort of, they don't have the teams, they don't have the people bandwidth to also put in these data points in your, say you give them a software which will help them manage their business, but they should have the team or the employees to do it for them, right? They need some people there. So what we realize is that we have to automate the process. We cannot depend on these guys to put in data. We have to capture data from the manufacturing units. So we started talking to the manufacturers of the units. So for example, we spoke to these German manufacturers like Swingstetter. We spoke to German manufacturers who are actually manufacturing the entire manufacturing machines, which were manufacturing, say, tiles, or which are manufacturing concrete. So we spoke to the manufacturers and we started to understand that how these machines work. And can we capture data about quality? For example, what is quality? Quality is a component of 2 to 3 things. One is, what are the raw materials you're using? What is the ratio in which the raw materials you're using? What is the process you followed? And what are the various steps of that process, right? So we realized that if we can start capturing data from the machines without depending on human data entry, only then can be a successful model built out of this. Because I have to today, any point of day, I am essentially buying material from 300 manufacturers. I cannot be dependent on them entering the data of what they're doing at their plants. So I have to automate. So when we work with some of these manufacturers, we realize that there is technology around this. There are certain touch points that if we put in certain sensors, certain load cells in these plants, it can give us data of raw material they have used. It can give us data of the quality of the raw material. For example, if I am working on a concrete plant, I can put in a moisture sensor, which will tell me that whether the cement has moisture content or not, or what is the percentage of moisture. If I'm working in a chemical manufacturing plant, I can put in load cell sensors that tell me that when they are mixing chemicals, what is the ratio they are mixing it in. So there are various sort of technologies that you can put into a manufacturing unit, which help you automate the entire digitization process of manufacturing. And what that helped us in was to understand what raw material is going into these plants. What is the process they are following? What is the quality of the finished goods they are selling? And then where we need to tweak to ensure that the quality that they make in the finished goods is something we can package and sell to people as a replacement for branded players. So idea was, suppose you want to sell concrete and you want to sell, you're competing with Ultratech or ACC. They have a huge amount of brand equity because they have traceability on the quality of the concrete they manufacture. I was going to buy from local players and I had to give the same level of traceability to the final consumer and show, okay, this is what they're doing and this is how we are maintaining quality.
No, I mean, that's incredible. And so you bridged that gap by using data and get data that other people didn't have, I guess.
Yeah, and data that had to be automated because you cannot, We were very sure. We had to change how. So basically, we took what we had to get the level of control on these small manufacturing units, which a large player would have on their own manufacturing unit.
Yeah.
And we had to automate the data because these people were not going to give us data.
They
were not going to feed their data.
Yeah.
So it's not like you are trying to get data from a movie theater where they tell you how many tickets are booked. They're not going to book. They're not going to. There's no data input. So we had to automate each and every data point we required to make that process seamless and actually allow us to sort of procure from these players, be sure of the quality involved.
Now I would like to talk a bit about fundraising.
Yeah.
The first time when you fundraised, how big did you think the market was?
Oh, we were not. We had no idea what it is, that it was this. I mean, to be honest, we were not even the company we are today. So that's whether neither we were the company we were today in 2016, neither we were the company in 2019. The thought process I have today, I didn't have it 6 months back. So it's not, forget a question of when I raised my first check. But I think a lot of it, what happens is that we were so concentrated on one material. We were doing a couple of materials, one state, and we had no idea that can this go to 10 product lines, multi-states. First of all, we were doing only in concrete and aggregates at that time. We were not even into cement, paint, chemicals, which we have started now. Second, we were only into the material space. Today, we are in the equipment rental space. We are in the other solution space, which we are slowly entering. So the idea, see, the vision sort of came across. We had no idea how. We were sure that the construction material market was large, but the vision to reach that did not exist when we went to raise our first check. We just sort of went to 3 to 4 funds. So I reached out to them like any other founder would, mailed them, LinkedIn, sort of messaged them. They looked at it. And I think they understood how large the market was better than us at that time, because they would have a better understanding of the market, right? They view startups every time and they realize. So I think when Axel put in the check, I think they were very clear that B2B is a very large markets. And I think for them at that time, it's about, if do we have the ambition to make it that large? And I think if they saw that, I think they put the money. And I think it's very simple, because I think Axel almost has done almost every large B2B company in India, right? So if they're into us, they're into Zetwork, they're into Bizongo, they're into, I think, Moglix, you name a B2B company and Axel's there. So for them, I think they had a thesis around B2B. So I think that sort of, they had a thesis around B2B, and they understood the markets, and they were very clear of what they are trying to build around B2B. And then when they saw us, I think they realized how large the market was. We never did. And we understood that, because then they gave us their sort of reports on the market. And then we understood that what they were looking at, and that sort of shaped our vision to eventually grow out.
And what happened after that was just crazy. I mean, you guys it's not a regular venture. It's not traditional financing, but you became one of India's fastest unicorns. What was that journey like?
Yeah, so journey was choppy. Also, it's not been so I think April 2019 we got our term sheet for the seed round. It was a 25 crore round, around valuation of the company around 100 odd crores, 110, 112 crores at that time. And we grew the company out the month, and then in August we signed the Series A, and that's when I think Aviral were talking of before the call of Anand, Nexus came on board. So Nexus and Tiger came on board then 2019, when we got around 20 million, around at a 80 million valuation at that time. So around 600 crores. We raised 140 crores. It was crazy at that time. I thought we had sort of we had got lucky, because we got like I think 6x valuations in 4 months, and we thought, wow, that this is not going to happen again. Okay. And then what happened was WeWork. So WeWork happened, and we were profitable. And I believe you, when we were initially raising our seed round, apart from the large players, so I'm not talking Axel and all did not have these questions. There were smaller VCs who said profitability is not good. It's not a great idea when you're growing up as a young company. And we had no choice. We had sort of leveraged everything. So you can't cash burn on when you mortgage your house. So that's not an option. Then WeWork happened, and the entire focus shifted on profitability. That is the business unit economics positive, and luckily we were always there, and we got a lot of interest to raise around about Feb 2020. And there was this VC from US. I can't disclose the name, but they gave us a term sheet at that time, around about 300 mil was the number they were looking at valuation, and we were very happy. We wanted to go. Then COVID happened, and this VC pulled the term sheet. And so so this is March 2020. So I think we got the term sheet Feb. They pulled it March, and we were very unsure of where we were, because it was the first time I had experienced something like that. But luckily we were profitable. We were making money, and I decided that, look, we don't need equity to grow, right? This business, we need a lot of, even if we are growing, and I know there's COVID and all, but we can do it with debt. So we reached out to a lot of debt partners, a lot of banks we got on board. So we got a lot of Indian national traditional banks on board, SBI, Bank of India, Axis, ICICI. We got everyone to lend. We also reached out to all the VCs, they helped a lot, Nexus, Axel, and they sort of, we then syndicated a large loan from Trifecta, Innoven, all the venture debt firms. And we raised around about 200 crores in debt to ride over COVID. And then, so that a lot of that came from Indian banks, and a lot of that came from venture debt firms. And we realized that, okay, even if a VC pulls a term sheet, we can continue this growth, irrespective of, obviously business was, April, May was severely hit due to COVID. But June, July onwards, business was back up, construction was back up. And we sort of wanted to close this out, and we raised that. And we said, then we got a term sheet in middle of COVID, around about 200 million from a new VC, which was Evolvence, which is a Middle Eastern fund. The older VC had pulled the term sheet, and we got a new term sheet, and we signed that. And this happened in around mid 2020. And then we raised around about some equity. We raised a very small, we another raised around 20 million at 200. And we grew this company out. We grew from 2020, when the term sheet got pulled, we were doing around 50 crores or around about 7 million a month. When we got the last term sheet in Jan-Feb, when we raised the unicorn round, we were at a run rate of around about 400 million. So we were doing around about 250 crores a month almost. So we had grown this company 5x year on year. And at that time, Tiger we were looking to raise a round at that time. And we reached out to our internal investors that, look, we are looking to raise a round. And the internal investors wanted to then had a lot of interest, and they did the round. And Tiger came on board with a large check, and we sort of raised 100 million at a unicorn. We're not only, I don't know if you're obviously, I don't think we're the fastest unicorn, because obviously, but we are the fastest seed to unicorn at this moment. I think we went seed to unicorn in 15 months or 18, something like that, 18 months, of which, June 2019 was the money came in for seed level, and the money for unicorn round came in at March 20. So around 20 odd months, of which some months were lost due to COVID. So yeah, fastest seed to unicorn. Also the fastest, I don't know if it's the fastest, but we are one of the companies which has raised, which is more relevant, I think. We had raised only $50 million to reach $900 million valuation before the unicorn round. So if you look at any other B2B company in India, they would have raised at least a couple of $100 million. We had raised a total of,
basically.
Yeah, we had raised $43 million in equity to make a $900 million company.
Wow.
Yeah, before we got the unicorn round. And the idea was, we raised as little as possible, kept a lot of founder equity.
Right.
So I think we are one of the few founding teams which have pretty high equity in the company. We run a tight ship, and we've sort of maintained. We've only raised when we've absolutely needed, raise a lot of debt to finance working capitals. Only go to equity to go for over the top growth. When you want to grow exponentially, you go and raise equity. Otherwise, equity has never been our go-to way of raising capital for the company.
Right. Oh, that's fantastic, and I think a lot of insights. You make it sound very easy, but it's not the way you scaled the company in a very capital efficient way as well. I mean, it would have been easy to raise money while burning founder equity as well, and not a lot of people outside the ecosystem know, but most founders of unicorns are left with very little by the time they get there because they've raised so much money and diluted so much. So it's
Yes,
pretty
yeah,
good.
and for me, I think it's inefficient to raise equity, which has you are say any VC knows, right? The IRR they expect is much higher than a debt company raise. So why would you raise at a higher IRR than you can raise at a lower IRR requirement? So idea is you only raise risky capital from equity, so that something that you don't you want for extraordinary growth. Otherwise, the idea is to raise the lowest cost of capital that you can.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Completely agreed. And so I'm guessing COVID really turbocharged you guys. You said you grew 5x since your term sheet that was pulled out and then the last
Yeah.
that you did. What does the future look like? Has COVID propelled you into another orbit? Um, how are you guys thinking of, the next couple of years now? What's ahead?
I think COVID and also the fact that a term sheet got pulled sort of propelled us. So what happened was, sometimes you get caught up in a frenzy of growth for all, growth at all costs, right? So you think you get your first check, you're valued at 100 crores, then you get a check at 600 crores, then you get a term sheet valuing at 2,000 crores. You suddenly understand that look, growth is very important, and let's go ahead. And you sometimes take decisions which may not be the greatest decisions. And what happened with that term sheet getting pulled and April, May COVID is that we got some time to breathe and think about what we were building, because we hadn't got that time since that first check. It was just about, can we go 2x from here? Can we go 3x from here? But we spent a lot of time internally thinking that, what are we trying to build out here? Why should it affect us if a term sheet got pulled? Technically, if you're running a profitable B2B company or any B2B companies shouldn't have a huge cash burn, and you should be able to grow at a certain pace irrespective of equity. So what changed? What is so depressing about a term sheet getting pulled or something like that? I think that's what sort of gave us some time. It took us some time off. April, everything was closed. So core team, me, Aditya, some of our core team members sort of spent some time across understanding where we want this company to be. Do we want this to be a material company? Do we want this to be a construction solutions company? What are the various facets we need to build out over the next 3-4 years? And where do we need to be irrespective of equity or no equity? And that's when we realized that there is a huge opportunity that COVID has thrown, because what happened with COVID was a lot of the infrastructure companies, infrastructure is one of the few areas where you need to keep working in new areas. So you are not like a manufacturer. You cannot keep working out of one location. You get a new project in every new location, and 20 kilometers away, 30 kilometers, you have to keep working. And when you're working, you need new vendors. Your old vendors are no longer efficient in the new area because there's a cost of transport. We realize that every time a construction company now starts a new project, they will have to go source new vendors. This is June, July. And most of the vendors are also struggling due to COVID. Most of the companies don't have the bandwidth to go search for new vendors and onboard new vendors in this situation. And we had 300 vendors onboarded across certain zones in India. So the opportunity was huge, because we realized that, okay, if one of our customers is going to a new location, to go in COVID and, go and meet a new manufacturing location, understand what process they follow is impossible. And we can just ask him to plug into our system and keep buying. And that sort of accelerated growth. And we realized that we are sitting on a gold mine here, because now this is going to further, while COVID has thrown a spanner in everyone's works, but for us, we had to look at the silver lining, that traditional companies are going to be further need a digital way of selling, and traditional infra companies would need someone who provides them a solution of procurement. They couldn't go out and source new vendors in new zones. So for us, that was sort of a situation where we had to capitalize, and we grew it. And we grew it today also. When I grow this company, now we have to grow it with or without equity. That's the way, where we look at this. And equity is an outcome. Valuations are obviously an outcome of what you're trying to build, right? Now, even if I don't get equity, we have to go out and either get revenues to drive internal accruals. We can get money from customers. We can get money because business is making money month on month. We are today, I think, one of the few companies, startups in India, which is a 4% month on month PAT company. Okay, so we make 4% PAT month on every last month, and we have a lot of debt lined up if equity doesn't come in. So we have built out a company which there is a growth landscape to where we want to reach, and we intend to reach there with or without equity capital coming in the play. And that's how we are looking at this. That's how we want to build this company out. If equity comes in, we'll reach there quicker and easier.
Right.
That's my take on this.
Understand.
Yeah.
Oh, fabulous, amazing story. And it just feels so good to talk to someone who is so rooted while having built such a massive organization. A lot of learning for me personally, and I think for Mazen as well. Thank you for that. We'll end with the final question that we ask our guests, which is, what's one piece of unfiltered feedback you've received during your journey which really changed the way you look at things?
So a lot of feedback. We see, I think one of the key things that I've always believed is that you need to make your own mistakes. And I think that is one of the feedback I got very early on. That, you can, so I got this from Axel very early on in my sort of first meeting, I think. Axel has his IC where there are 10, 15 partners.
Right.
So and all the well-known names of the industry, from Subrata to Aaron Daniel to Prashant, and everyone was having IC. And I think, I don't remember who said it. I think it was Anand, or it was Subrata. I don't know. That they said that, what if this happens? What if that happens? And then he sent and told me, why are you not doing it this way? And I told him, no, because other companies have tried to do it this way. It hasn't worked. And he said, no, you need to do it and even if it's wrong, you make your own mistake. If you think it's going to work, you make it once. Because I think one of the key problems that I always face as an entrepreneur is that when I've relied on other people's learnings, right? So when you read a book or you read some other people's learnings, and it's a great learning tool, but if you still in your guts think that something needs to be done, which is anti what everyone is telling you, I always believe you should try and pilot it out. It's very difficult as an entrepreneur to go back and feel that you relied on someone else's learnings and that shaped where your business is today. I've been a firm believer that you need to make your own mistakes. It helps you learn, first of all, and it helps you live with that mistake. Some of the most difficult things as an entrepreneur is that you sometimes it's so difficult to live with your mistakes that you've made. And I find it very difficult to live with a mistake if all my learning, all my gut calls are telling me to do something, but I'm doing something else just because it's written somewhere as a concept. And then, it'll keep in my mind that, okay, why did I do that if it turns out to be wrong? And one of the key learnings that has stayed with me is that you need to since you're building something new, what you're building for India has not even, there is no like for like comparison what we are doing even globally. So there could be new learnings. The traditional principles are also going to be challenged, and you as a company need to make your own mistakes. You cannot rely on what the traditional largest players in the industry have done. And I think that's how you will build out a company which is category defining, where you will learn your own mistakes, you will make your own mistakes, and you will find your own success path. I think that is one of the key things I tell every entrepreneur, that if you think it should be done, don't listen to what any other entrepreneur thinks, or don't listen to what is being told in some business book. Make that mistake once. Go out and try it out for a couple of months, and if you realize you are wrong, then you're okay, you're living with it because you went with your gut.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Great way to end. Thank you for the conversation, Souvik.